O heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere and fillest all things, treasury of blessings, and giver of life, come and abide in us, and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O God. Last week, we started, I shared some statistics, some ominous statistics about the nature of membership in the church or membership in a religious body and declining attendance, declining membership in Western society. And I came across two things, actually one last night and one this very morning, that I thought is in those lines, and it helps to sort of frame even more helpfully what we're looking at in terms of understanding in creation theology, even before we get to the fall, our identity, who God made us to be, what kind of creature we are, what kind of creation we live in, and what our mission to that creation is. So one, and some of you will probably come across this, there's an article in NPR, and the basis of the article is, in the face of declining membership and declining attendance, churches are doing ever more radical things to reinvent themselves, basically, to try to attract new members or to reach new people. And so some of the statistics that are thrown out there are the same ones that I've shared with you. In America, we dropped in 2022 below 50% membership in religious bodies for the first time in history. All right, we had been at around 70% from around the time we started keeping statistics on these sort of things, all the way up until about the year 2000. Right before the pandemic, we had been declining rapidly for the last 2 decades. And before the pandemic, we started to hit closer to around 54% or something like that. And now, after the pandemic, we've dipped down into the 40s. And as I shared last week, the statistic on do you attend worship regularly is even more problematic. That decline in America started actually in the 70s, around the time of the massive liturgical reforms of Vatican II really started hitting our Roman Catholic churches, the Roman Catholic churches, I should say. And we've seen attendance at church, attendance at any religious observation from the 1970s all the way through today has just been on a steep decline. And now we're at something like 24% of the given American public on any given Sunday or Saturday is at a worship experience or attends worship. There's a lecture that I listened to from a social anthropologist about this. One of the things that's interesting is that Europe, it's always helpful for us as Americans to look beyond ourselves sometimes, but in Europe and Australia and New Zealand, these trends predate our own trends by a few decades. Particularly in Europe, when you look at the post-World War II experience, the experience of World War II in Europe, when it was fought on their soil, tended to very rapidly secularize Europe throughout the remainder of the 20th century, even as it made us in the Cold War more openly religious and more unwilling to say that we weren't a member of a religious body or that we didn't attend service. So as you know, when you look at that in the second half of the 20th century, Americans, in a sense, stayed about the same religious. We kind of used our religious identity as part of our understanding of the battle with the Soviet Union. They're the atheists and the communists. We're the God believers, God-fearing Christians, and we believe in democratic capitalism, right? So those were the two main things. One of the things I've always noted is that the moment the Berlin Wall fell, we just kicked God right out of that equation in America. I mean, ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the kind of religious language that I grew up with in the 80s, in the 70s and 80s, was just, boom, kicked right to the curb, and we've been rapidly secularizing ever since, both in our political discourse, but also in our sense of identity. No longer did we have this huge, atheistic power that we were combating with our sense of freedom and liberty and faith in God and trust in Jesus Christ. Once we didn't have that power, we've seen a real leveling off and then a decline. And this sociologist described this as generational displacement, or generational replacement. As the decades went, and as we've gone in, certainly in the last 2 decades, what's happened is that older generations that started their life with more faith tended to be more consistent in their observation of that faith, but younger people, younger generations, have had progressively less faith in their life. And you can see this if you think in the 1970s, religious attendance, that means actually getting up and going to church on Sunday, has been declining. That means you have an increasing population that's growing up without going to church. And his point about that, which is very interesting, is that once you are raised from a very young age to feel that this is optional, you're much less likely to continue in it as you reach adulthood. And then he makes an argument, that's his, in a sense, his assessment of it, that once you view traditional Christian worship as strange and unfamiliar to yourself, it's almost impossible to return. So he makes this claim, not that it's relevant for us, but he makes a claim that this decline in membership, this decline in religious identity and practice, he thinks is irreversible. And what he points to is that modernization tends to produce secularization of identity. The more modern your country is, the more modern your culture is, the lower rank religion plays in your people. And so you look at the quality of life index and what are the best countries to live in, they tend to be the most modern countries. And they also tend to be the least religious countries. And when you go down the line and you get to the sort of last 100 to 140 countries in that equation, the further you go out into more religious, the more they tend to be not modern. Not modern. So modernism as a function of culture tends to dislocate people from their religious and spiritual identities. So we've been talking about all that. He does say that he'll think some people will return to religion, or having been raised without religion will seek it out. And in fact, I would say that in the Orthodox Church, that's one of the main things we're seeing in the growth of catechumens in our parishes, is that oftentimes it's young people who don't have any church experience, for whom it's all unfamiliar. And rather than the so-called exoticness of orthodoxy driving them away, it actually attracts them. And we'll be coming back to that in a moment. But with this other thing, returning to this NPR article, which I thought was interesting, and Deacon Stevens saw this morning as well, they talked about how churches are now changing their strategy, right? They're doing their marketing research. They're realizing that their product is no longer landing with their consumers, and so they change it. Of course, the Western churches, the Protestant churches, have been doing this for decades. The church growth movement, the sort of evangelical megachurch movement, that was all predicated on the idea that in America, there were a lot of people who didn't practice any faith, but who had some kind of faith identity. And all we needed to do was to tap into that identity and lower the barrier of entry. We ask nothing of you, we require nothing of you, and we turn religion into entertainment. And this was very effective for many megachurch. Depending on how you quantify success, if you look at numbers, if you look at money, if you look at facilities, if you look at the perception of growth and expansion, it was incredibly successful. But what did it give the people? Not much. And so even those churches are now facing a decline and realizing, and many of them very consciously so, we have focused so much on dumbing down the gospel and entertaining Americans and playing to this general sense of a Christian identity, but without any real praxis involved, that we've given them candy and they needed substance. So this isn't new, but one of the things that's happening now is they're going into interesting realms, and this NPR article just described a few of them. One is a church where it's really a gardening church. They get together, they have a little Bible study, and then they go out and they garden, and they just work shoulder to shoulder, and they grow vegetables, and they use the garden to help feed the community around them. And so there's no like formal worship service. There's no, let's get together in church and hear a sermon and sing hymns and receive communion. All of that's out. And one of the interesting things is that a lot of the people in this article, basically what they said was, we're seeking alternatives to church now because what was happening on Sunday morning just wasn't doing it for me. Going to church, the formal idea of worship, of hearing a sermon, of going for communion, that just didn't seem to meet me in my life anymore. And so what other churches have done, they've done, they'll put yoga mats out, and they'll have yoga, church yoga, and people will gather and do church yoga. One, an Episcopal church does something called breathing under the stained glass, where they get together on Sunday evening and they do breathing exercises. And interestingly, they attempt in their lingo to attach breathing exercises that come from Far Eastern religions, predominantly Hinduism and Buddhism, to this idea of the breath of God inhabiting you. Okay, now this is dangerous stuff. There's a lot of caution in the literature, and we've been talking about the inbreathing of God, and so I thought this was really especially apropos. Remember, with the statue in the ancient world as idol has these open mouth and open nostrils, so that the last element of installing an idol in a idolatrous temple, a pagan temple, is the idea that the spirit that will inhabit that idol breathes into it, goes through its nostrils or through its mouth. And that parallel to that, but more significantly, when God creates Adam, he breathes into his nostrils the breath of life, meaning that Adam is the image and likeness of God. All right, we've talked a lot about that, but just to pull that out, that's very, very important that God is the inbreathing of us. But the other part of that is there are other things that can inbreathe people, and we have to be really cautious with that. That's why there's caution about breathing, actually, in the ascetical tradition of Orthodoxy, because there's not just one spirit that can enter you. So you have to use real discernment, and you have to be under guidance to do these sorts of things. So they're taking these ideas and saying, oh, look, the breathing things of Buddhism and Hinduism will get people to do that. It'll ease their anxiety, it'll ease their depression, and we'll connect it to the inbreathing of God, and it's all very fascinating. And wouldn't you know it, for some people, this is compelling stuff. They think, boy, it feels strange to get on a yoga mat in church and to be doing yoga where we used to worship, but I kind of like it, is what I'm quoting here. At the heart of all this is a loss of a connection. It's a loss of a connection. It's people who either were going to church on Sunday or increasingly aren't going to church on Sunday and have no idea what they're doing there. We've taken that for granted. We've taken that for granted for decades, because if we go back far enough, we realize that oftentimes the way churches operated was, everyone's basically Christian anyway. We just need to adapt everything to what they want. And the more they've done that, the more they've lost the connection of what is this thing that we do. And this is what we've been talking about going back to creation theology. What is it that we're doing when we come to church? Am I just here for my own sort of psychological needs? Am I here just so that I can, have a little respite from the craziness of the world, and I was up anyway, so I just decided to go to church, and whatever. Are we here to do something? Do we know what our identity is? Do we know what it means to be the image and likeness of God? Do we know what it means for him to give us a command of mission and for us to move out in that mission? And the whole thing is what we've seen in the decline of Christianity, and it often happens with anything that takes for granted its success, is that it starts losing its connections. It starts losing its reason, losing its identity. And then they desperately try to reinvent that identity over and over and over again, whether it's megachurch worship as entertainment, or it's gardening, or yoga, or breathing, or meditation. Coffee is a big thing, which is really, again, very interesting. In traditional cultures, coffee is a ritual. You know that in South America especially. Coffee is a ritual. Tea is a ritual in its origins. Tobacco is a ritual in its origins. Native Americans, when they smoked tobacco, it wasn't for the nicotine high. It was done in religious ceremonies because they believed that tobacco was part of their ritual of changing themselves and making themselves more open to the spiritual world. Again, we take these things for granted. We drink coffee, I just need a little pick-me-up. But coffee was a ritual, and the very same thing. If you're sensitive to caffeine, you can drink coffee, you can drink tea in a ritual of communion, in a ritual setting of connection, and it can have this very, very powerful thing. Coffee, tea, tobacco, all these things that we now kind of abuse. Well, tobacco got the boot, we decided no more tobacco. Which, interestingly, I don't know if you've been to New York recently, but it's fascinating how it used to be that you smelled cigarette smoke. If you went anywhere downtown, you smelled cigarette smoke everywhere, Now, if you go to like Brooklyn, all you smell is weed. Everywhere. You smell no cigarettes. You smell weed everywhere you go. It's even in the car, you're driving through Brooklyn, and you just, whoa, is there a skunk around here? So, it's just weed everywhere. So we've gotten rid of tobacco. Now we have weed, and everyone's smoking weed in places like New York. It's really astonishing. It's all that you smell. But all these things are tied to rituals. And so what these churches are doing to try to reconnect and reinvent themselves is to bring those things in, not in their original ritualistic context, of course, but merely as a way of getting people through the door. I'll mention this. This is funny. Forgive me for reading from my phone. I prefer not to do that. But this one pastor that runs the gardening thing talks about the BPs. Let me see. Hold on. This is funny. What every church growth person used to understand. Oh, come on. Where is it? Yeah. The BPs, this was the principles of church growth in America. Butts in the pews, bucks in the plate, baptisms in the pool, and building programs. And that was it. Like, that was what you were intentionally focusing on. If you were not successful in those metrics, then you were not successful. And you notice that none of that contains anything to do with whether or not we are actually engaging what worship in the Christian tradition actually means. It's all about, in a sense, finding your market niche. So there's no wonder that it's declining. There's no wonder that it's declining. And for our purpose, my contention is that we're already deep into a massive transition, even within our understanding of the Orthodox Church and our mission. Every Orthodox church has a mission. There's no such thing as a church that does not have a mission. Why? Because outside these doors, fewer than 25% of people anywhere in America are going to any house of worship for any reason. And fewer than 50% would claim that they're even members of any kind of religious body whatsoever. So we can no longer assume, well, we're here, like, our church is for us, and it has things that we like and that are familiar to us. Well, that's okay. No one's going to change that. But we have to realize that we have been given something that is for the life of the world. And we can no longer assume that the life of the world is covered, that everyone's got their place to go. They don't have their place to go. And when they do go there, they're getting yoga and tumo, pranayama breathing, and other things that have nothing to do with the Spirit of God. They're not getting the real thing. And this is the mission and the moment of Orthodoxy in the 21st century, is this is the real thing. We've never gone through these kind of Vatican II upheavals of our worship. We've never gone through these massive revisions of our theology or our moral teaching. We have held because we've not forgotten. But even in not forgetting, and what I mean by that is we haven't forgotten all the riches of the faith, all the riches of the truth of Christianity are in our services. That's why we don't change them. But not changing them isn't really enough. We have to make connections. We have to become aware, each and every one of us, that these things are meaningful for me, and now I know why. Now I know that it's embedded into the very way that I was made. All right? That's what we've been looking at with creation, and I'm going to turn to that here in a second. But we have a mission, and we've got to understand that things like, again, in culture wars are often cast in terms of morality and in the law's capacity in morality. And there's truth to that, of course, but there's a deeper root to that as well. And we're going to be looking at that when we sort of drill even deeper into our sense of what our mission is. Right? So we've got to make those connections. We haven't lost anything in Orthodoxy, but we're also not entirely aware of everything we have. And we need to be, because the world needs that. And the numbers bear that out. And the stories of what is happening bear that out. The world is going to need it more and more. Before I dive back into then creation theology, any questions or comments or anything else anyone wants to share along these lines? Yes? Yeah. Yeah. Right. 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 Yeah. So for our home audience here, once Protestants detached in sola scriptura the belief that Christianity is embedded only in the Bible, and you don't need any other sacred tradition to be able to navigate it, you open up the sort of anti-culture that we see today, a culture that has drifted so far away from its origins in Christian worship, in Christian practice, in what we call sacred tradition. And what we've done is we've abstracted Christianity. When I say we here, I mean Western society, by which we mean usually Protestant Western philosophy, which is to abstract Christianity into textual proofs and to disconnect it from the way we live. And once you do that, the line goes down. You know, that's why I would say that what happened in some of you are going to have probably experiences or know family members when Vatican II happened. For those of you who have family in the Roman Catholic experience, and all these sweeping changes occurred, and suddenly there's no relationship of confession to communion, and before you had to do all these things, and now you just go receive, and now the service has changed, and they're doing contemporary music. Well, what happens psychologically there is when you say, you know what, we're going to apply modernist ideals to our worship to make it more relevant to people, what people hear on a deeper level is, that must mean that all the things we were doing before must not have been as important as you told us they were. And then they drift. And it's very predictable. It's very predictable. And obviously in Pittsburgh, how many communities in Pittsburgh which had 5 Roman Catholic churches now only have 1, and they've consolidated all of them because their numbers just bottomed out. Now, obviously, you can say some of that has to do with population decline and economic decline from the 70s through the 80s and 90s and that sort of thing. But it also is the fact that there's still a lot of people living in those communities. We forget this as Orthodox Christians. You know, we have, and I've mentioned this in maybe it was the last council meeting, but a lot of our parishes are in pretty dire straits. And the thing that's really notable about that, and by dire straits, I mean parishes where there's fewer than 25 people in church on a Sunday. That's kind of a threshold because, well, it's not even a threshold. That obviously 25 people in church, what can't you do when you have that? Well, you can't pay a priest to be there full time. And everything that we do assumes a full-time priest. But the thing is, in all of those communities, even in the most hard-hit communities in the Mon Valley, there's still a lot of people living there. And there's still a lot of those people living there who don't go to church anywhere. So it's not just a matter of population decline. It can't just be a matter of population decline. And we've seen parishes that are able to grow in neighborhoods that are bombed out, basically, you know, neighborhoods that are really rough. I mean, the fact that Father Tom Soroka has grown the church in McKees Rocks, if you don't want to stray too far from the parish in McKees Rocks, where that location is. And I don't know if it's getting better today, but obviously that area has been hit so hard for so long. But they've grown. I would contend this: if you can grow a church in McKees Rocks, you can grow a church anywhere. Anywhere. Population decline, difficulties in society, that's not an excuse. There are still people there, and they still got nowhere to go because no one has the words of life. No one has the sacred tradition. We do, and we've got to receive that as a mission. We've got to realize God didn't say, I'm giving this to you, now enjoy it, and I've just given something different to everybody else. That's not the way it works. He's saying, you have received this fullness of the faith. You have received this fullness of the life in Christ. Now go and baptize all the nations. Well, we used to think that meant, sail off to Africa. But it's now, and it's here, and it's right in not even in our backyard, it's in our front yard. It's in our front yard, right? So what I've mentioned before and what I've been trying to hammer home, and we've been using, and I apologize, but also I think there's a method to this. We've sort of talked about this in a way that is somewhat repetitive and somewhat, we keep coming back to these same things. It's because they are existentially so important. And that is that when we read Genesis liturgically, when we read who and what kind of creature the human person is and what kind of world we live in, what we come to the realization is that there is a world view that is being communicated to us as we read this text, as we read all the biblical texts. Much of that worldview assumes that we're reading it or hearing the word of that worldview within a living way of life, which itself originates in that worldview. Once you start hearing those things outside of that original way of life, you start reading other things into the worldview. And that obscures our ability to read Scripture. It obscures our ability to understand what's really at stake in a text like Genesis. So we've talked a lot about this, and this is the whole problem with trying to read the Bible as if it exists on its own and not within a worshiping community. All of Scripture was written within and is to be received within a worshiping community. Why? Because worship is at the very foundation and heart of who we are and of what kind of creature we are. When God places Adam, when he breathes his breath, he makes Adam the image and likeness of himself. He installs him, he enthrones him in the garden, which is in the ancient world, as we've said many times, an image of worship and paradise and temple. It's not primitive. It's not even simple if in our minds, and I know I keep coming back to this, but it's the way I've always thought or used to think of Adam and Eve in the garden is, it's just a garden. and you just kind of wander around, and I'm hungry, and I've got nothing better to do. That's not what the language means. The language indicates that the Garden of Paradise is the temple of God. Adam is the high priest. He is breathed in with the very Spirit of God to be his image and likeness. And he's given a mission, and that mission is to go out and spread that paradise and then return all things back to him. And this is the fundamentally priestly motion of the human vocation in the world, meaning that worship in the temple, and we need to be very explicit about this. St. Ephrem the Syrian is very explicit about this. All ancient civilizations saw themselves this way. I'll turn to that in a second here. We have time. But basically, the pattern of reality, the pattern of the worldview, is that God places the human person as the crown of creation in his temple to participate with the angels in the worship of God, and then to move outward and spread that paradise, spread that order, spread that life and completion of all things in the rest of God, in the Sabbath rest of God, to all of creation. So it's an ascending and a descending, this movement of going out. And it is the source of all human civilization. The meaning of the four rivers in Genesis, where there's four rivers mentioned, and the four rivers obviously don't have the same source, but the text says that paradise, the Garden of Paradise, is the source of those rivers. And what does that mean? Each and every one of those rivers is associated with an ancient civilization. And what the Hebrew biblical text is saying is the source of all civilization is the original civilization of paradise, where the human person worshiped God rightly and received a vocation to go forth and spread that. And the whole purpose of civilization then, the meaning of technology, we talked about this a little bit on Wednesday night, was to employ it all in the worship of God and the lifting up not only of the human person, but of all creation into the paradise of God. So that's the fundamental meaning of what civilization is supposed to be. When we look at ancient Babylon, when we look at Egypt, when we look at the Greeks and the Romans, everyone in the ancient world understood this. The most important structure that you built in your city was the temple, was the place of worship. And every aspect of that city flowed outward from the temple and was given its order by that temple. In Egypt, for instance, all education of all classes was controlled by the priests, the Egyptian priests, so that all of society was culturally connected to the worship of Egypt, which was, diverse in some ways, but it had also unifying elements. In fact, worship and ritual, which lies at the heart of human identity and what it means to function as the image and likeness of God, is a unifying effect on people. And that's why last year we talked about some of these other wonderful and amazing and head-scratching archaeological finds that predate agriculture. They predate the economic ordering of the human person. What were hunter-gatherers doing en masse first, long before they domesticated animals and planted crops? They were building temples. And so we see primarily examples of this in what are ancient Mesopotamia, but are nowadays in Turkey. But we see this even in Genesis. It's interesting when you look in Genesis and look at how often one of the patriarchs has an encounter with God, and what do? They build an altar and they set up pillars. And what are we finding throughout that world archaeologically? But these massive complexes, predominantly of pillars, of pillars, Stonehenge, same thing. Stonehenge are pillars. Stonehenge was not an astronomical instrument. It was a place of worship. It had astronomical elements, most likely, but it was predominantly a unifying place of worship, much later than these other ones were. We need to quit. But the whole point is that everything flows from worship and returns to worship. And this is capable of encompassing the entirety of human life. the entirety of ancient civilization. The reason why ancient civilizations saw the impetus to extend themselves and to create empire was precisely out of this idea, fallen as it was in its actual practice. They believed that to take their civilization and to spread their civilization to the world was an essential instinct within the human heart. And that's been true all the way up to the present day. All the way up to the present day. Unfortunately, we have to stop, but I could talk about this stuff for hours. Fair warning, the homily today is going to contain these same themes, which is just sort of, well, it's part of the story, and it drills down to the heart of the story. So some of this you might hear, I don't know exactly how it'll come out, but some of this might be in the homily. But we'll meet again next week, and then we'll take our break over the Christmas holidays.